Now it's time to welcome our first speaker, Benjamin Lossazé, who's going to present a paper on the humorous stance of Debussy's Shakespeare. Benjamin is assistant professor at the University of Clermont-Auvergne in France. He holds an agrégation in music and a PhD on the subject of Debussy and humor, from which he has drawn a monograph published in last year, L'Humour de Debussy, Debussy's Humor, which won the French National Award Music of the Muses this year. So Benjamin, we're ready for you, whenever you like.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference, which promises to be fascinating in view of the themes through which the question of Shakespeare and music will be addressed. And at first glance, a paper on Debussy is not the most intuitive thing in such a conference, since unlike many of his contemporaries and fellow artists, Debussy does not count Shakespeare theater among his main sources of inspiration. However, he does place him alongside Ibsen and Laforgue at the pinnacle of his dramatic pantheon. And when he mentions Shakespeare or his plays in his letters or in his music reviews, Debussy never refers to him in anything but laudatory terms. And it turns out that several scenic or purely musical projects formed throughout his career refer directly or indirectly to the Shakespearean universe, despite the fact that only about 7 minutes of Debussy's music truly related to Shakespeare remain. The longest of these is almost ridiculously short, since it consists of 2 excerpts from the incidental music for King Lear, which was originally intended to be much more developed. The actor and director André Antoine had decided to stage the play and embody the king himself. And for this reason, he had contacted Debussy to write the incidental music. The composer was then the victim of his usual tendency to procrastinate, which led to the end of his collaboration with Antoine. In the end, only 2 brief excerpts remain of this long process, a fanfare and a dreamlike piece for Lear's sleep. Although they add nothing to Debussy's glory, they are nonetheless interesting, especially in view of the version performed by André Antoine, for which they were originally intended, in its French translation by Pierre Loti and Émile Vedel. Antoine states in his recollections that, I quote, "The 2 writers, Loti and Vedel, while respecting the Shakespearean masterpiece in its order and its entirety, enjoyed writing Lear with archaisms of language that make the Shakespearean tragedy, without diminishing its greatness and power, a marvelous tale of the round table." End of quote. Thus, through the translation, this Shakespearean tragedy is adorned with a slight layer of fantasy, thanks to the introduction of deliberately archaic elements into the language. Similarly, Debussy's fanfare transposes these archaisms by using modality. If we put this in relation to the fact that the solemn grandiloquence of the brass instruments here seems very incongruous in relation to Debussy's usual style, which is generally much more subtle, nuanced, fleeting, we can assume that there is at least a hint of humor in this fanfare. It turns out that the testimonies of those who knew Debussy agree in describing a man who constantly approached the world around him with a certain humorous or ironic detachment. This is reflected in his music, since no fewer than 75 Debussy works deal at least partly with humor, although this aspect of Debussy's output is generally neglected. Given his appetite for humor, it's not surprising that Debussy always considered Shakespeare from a comic perspective in his works, thus turning his back on a tendency among a majority of composers to approach mainly tragic plays. Take, for example, the case of Berlioz and his works, such as Romeo and Juliet, Ophelia's Death, funeral march for the last scene of Hamlet, and King Lear, which lacks the humorous view Debussy would add to it. Debussy certainly approached the tragic Shakespeare, but when he did so, he also took a comic perspective. This is, for example, the case of Hamlet. It turns out that Debussy, who had in 1889, at the age of 26, filled out a Proust questionnaire, had answered Hamlet to the item, your favorite heroes in fiction. Indeed, Hamlet marked him greatly, as can be seen in his letters, in which he happens to quote extracts from the play on several occasions, but always with a humorous goal. For example, when he wants to complain, he always says there is something rotten in the state of Denmark. He no doubt drew this idea of turning the tragic heaviness of Hamlet into comic lightness from his passion for Jules Laforgue. Laforgue was himself haunted by Shakespeare's Hamlet and proposed a humorous rewriting entitled Hamlet or the Consequences of Filial Piety. Following him, Debussy was to indulge in a similar game in his own way, since, as is little known, in 1899 he wrote the first and only chapter of an absurd novel project that remained unfinished, entitled Hester and the Madhouse, featuring the character of Hamlet among other residents in this madhouse. For example, Roderick Usher from The Fall of the House of Usher by Poe. In this context, Hamlet is not only described as a gentle maniac set on paternal revenge, but also as the apostle of the revenge of art. It is to him that we owe the notation of the music of the spheres and the destruction of the temple of hand-me-down ideas. At one point, he comes into conflict with Monsieur Fenêtre, a double character, somebody who is two people at the same time, like two windows. Fenêtre means windows. Monsieur Fenêtre shouts to him, "You're only a dirty old neurasthenic ham, and I'm fed up with your Shakespeare." Some other time, the madhouse is visited by a very real character in the person of the actor Mounet Sully, who comes 3 times a week to find inspiration in the gestures of the fool. Indeed, Mounet Sully, who played Hamlet among other roles, was well known for his frantic and exaggerated gestures and diction. So in Debussy's mind, it doesn't seem inconsistent to him to come regularly to study the attitudes of madmen for inspiration. In short, in addition to making fun of certain contemporary artists, Debussy sketches here a very goofy novel, far removed from the impressionist mists to which he is often reduced. And for this, he relies in particular on a very playful vision of the character of Hamlet, turning this character pretending to be mad into a real loony. Given Debussy's humorous approach to Shakespearean plays, it would not be surprising to find that he was also interested in his comic output. This is indeed the case for 2 Shakespearean comedies, As You Like It and A Midsummer Night's Dream. As for the former, it is a project that Debussy pursued for the longest period of his career without leading to the slightest note of music. Not much is known about an early stage music project for an adaptation of the play by Maurice Beaucaire in 1886. And on the other hand, more is known about the idea of composing an opera based on As You Like It in 1902 and 1903. Debussy had just created Péléas et Mélisande and sought to present himself on stage from a new perspective. Apparently, it was through Anglo-Saxon humor that he thought he would find his salvation, since at the same time he began to work on another opera project, this time based on The Devil and the Belfry by Poe. For As You Like It, he was in contact with Paul-Jean Toulet as librettist, and their correspondence reveals his attraction to the character of Touchstone, one of Shakespeare's most iconic fools. Debussy wrote to Toulet, "Don't be afraid of developing the character of Touchstone, which is so fantastic and so individual." Unfortunately, the project was soon interrupted when Toulet went to Asia, from which he returned severely addicted to opium, which prevented him from considering going any further. At least for the time being, for he contacted Debussy again at the end of 1917, this time to ask him for incidental music for the translation he had written of the play. However, It was Debussy who was indisposed at this time, as he was struggling against the cancer, which would cause his death a few months later. Failing to set the character of touchstone to music, Debussy had 3 opportunities to turn to this other iconic gesture called Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream, a play that Debussy loved and about which he evoked, I quote, that atmosphere of enchantment indispensable to all those who know how to remain big children and whose soul are more curious about the unreal than about contemporary history, end of quote. In 2 of the 3 cases in which Debussy referred to this play, the link to A Midsummer Night's Dream is indirect and involves the quotation of a musical work that was itself inspired by this comedy. Indeed, in his children's ballet, The Toy Box, La Boîte à Joujoux, Debussy refers to Mendelssohn's famous wedding march from Midsummer Night's Dream. It arrives near the end of the ballet. The couple is not made up of a fairy and a donkey, but of a doll and a little soldier. And the theme of the wedding march is the musical translation to the expression, they lived happily ever after. While Debussy quotes Mendelssohn in a quite irreverent way by adding a layer of parodic humor to a content which is already comical, another reference, this time to Weber's Oberon, shows greater respect. It can be found at the end of the prelude published in 1913. The fairies are exquisite dancers. The last 3 notes quote the first 3 notes of Weber's opera by lowering them by 1 semitone, suggesting the horn of the fairy king. Oops. However, the title of the prelude has nothing to do with Shakespeare, since it refers instead to Peter Pan in Kensington Garden, and more precisely to the illustration by Arthur Rackham, in which a fairy is seen dancing on a spider's web, while the spider plays the cello and a grasshopper plays the clarinet. But through this musical quotation from Oberon, Debussy links the mischievous fluidity of the fairy dance to the word of A Midsummer Night's Dream, which was also illustrated by Rackham, just as he links the prelude, the fairies are exquisite dancers, to this other prelude published in a first book in 1910 called Puck's Dance, La Danse de Puck. Let's look into this prelude, which is undoubtedly the pinnacle of Shakespearean's Debussy, at least among the musical works completed by the composer. The work begins in a rather unusual manner with a monodic line, a procedure usually found at the beginning of a fugue, but Debussy turns his back on this austere genre and embraces, by contrast, the carefree mischievousness of this kind of joking elf, a character whom Debussy himself described as a cheerful nocturnal wanderer, a cunning rascal, a gentle prankster. The initial hopping rhythm is the same as for other jigs composed by Debussy when he was inspired by joyful, exuberant, and even humorous Anglo-Saxon works, such as The Little Shepherd, Homage to Pickwick after Twain, or The Devil in the Belfry after Poe. The main theme, which is associated to this rhythm, is a derivation of a melody found in the previous prelude, the Sunken Cathedral, which is built on the exact same intervals. With this self-referential process, Debussy turns the austerity of the cathedral upside down to feed Puck's capricious mischief. This capricious aspect is also translated by a rhythmic irregularity on several levels. At the level of rhythmic figures, by the alternation of short-long rhythm. At the level of the prolation, by the alternation of binary dotted rhythms and ternary sextuplets. And at the level of the metrics, since the first two bars are repeated in the varied manner at bars 3 and 4, and then the first beat is omitted, which has the effect of shifting the metric stability. This irregularity is aggravated by melodic variations, notably through the unexpected introduction of an upward fleeting melodic line, and by the irregular phrasing. In other words, Puck's dance is characterized by great freedom, and it's from this great freedom that comes the humorous style of the piece, especially as this freedom is counterbalanced by the great rigidity of an Oberon call, on call, which echoes both the one Debussy would quote on the Fairies are exquisite dancer, even though it's not the same on call, and the grandiloquent solemnity of King Lear's fanfare. It's repeated 5 times out of the tone of Puck's dance, sounding like a call of duty, which seems to trouble Puck for a moment, but only for a brief moment. Here. At the end of the prelude, Puck finally gives in to his master's insistent call and evaporates in a furtive rising melodic line. While the direct references to Shakespeare in Debussy's works end here, it should be noted that, that Puck's dance, which was written in 1910, seems to feed the spirit of a number of works composed by Debussy at the same time or a bit later, in which this mischievous fluidity is to be found. All of these pieces are humorous, bear the indication scherzando, playful, and are based on what in my book, L'Humour de Claude Debussy, I describe as Debussy's scherzando style. In this figure, we can see that a wide range of parameters is used by Debussy in a comic perspective in Puck's dance, and that these same elements are found in these other works from the last decade of his creative life. For instance, melodies similar as Puck's, that is to say capricious, bouncy, twirling melodies with great rhythmic variety and stops and sudden outbursts are to be found in the study for chromatic degrees. Or in the study for repeated notes. As well as in the whimsical and light interlude of the sonata for violin and piano. The Rhapsody for Clarinet in B flat goes, in my opinion, even further in its analogy to Puck's dance, and the fact that the two works were composed at the same time, early 1910, is no coincidence. For example, the Rhapsody has a theme noted scherzando, which is very similar to that of Puck's dance. The work begins in a dreamily slow nocturnal mood, reminiscent of the general setting of A Midsummer Night's Dream, and gradually builds up in a mischievous manner until a climax interrupted by horn blasts brings the festivities to an end by the evaporation of the clarinet's high-pitched melodic line. When one observes that the little Shakespearean prankster in Puck's dance is constantly called to order by an Oberon's horn motive and ends up flying high into the treble, one cannot help but be struck by the analogies between these two works. On. Now. In the case of these scherzando-style works, there is no longer any mention, at least not explicitly, of Puck, nor of A Midsummer Night's Dream, nor even of Shakespeare, but the fact remains that the spirit of Puck blows over these works. In a way, this calls in mind what I was saying earlier when I explained that Debussy had formed several stage projects inspired by Anglo-Saxon comic literature, notably Shakespeare and Poe, to renew his musical language following the creation of Péléas et Mélisande. Similarly, it appears that a work such as the Puck's Dance, which once again evokes an English comedy, enabled him to explore new expressive manners which would prove fruitful in the last decade of his creative life, and which, without explicitly referring to Shakespeare, nonetheless bear the mark of his work. Debussy has only bequeathed 7 minutes of music directly inspired by Shakespeare. But through humor, it turns out that the influence of the Bard of Avon extends over a much larger part of his work. Thank you very much.